Hello. Hold on.
Good afternoon and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Global Talk with the topic China atrocities on Uyghur Muslims. Why do many countries remain silent? Today is Tuesday, 15th of March 2022. It is a great day today to discuss a very important issue among us. This event is organized by Center Southeast Asia Studies under leadership Mr. Arisman. And my name is Asep Setiawan, Research Fellow of CSEAS and lecturer at Graduate School of Political Science, University of Muhammadiyah, Jakarta. I will be a moderator for around next 2 hours in this interesting discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have an introduction for the topic first? This is important to note that in May 2014, the Chinese government launched the Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism in the SURAR against Uyghur and Turkish Muslim. Research by Stanford Law School Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic and Human Rights Watch, along with reports from many organizations, including internal Chinese government documents, show that China has committed and continues to commit crimes against humanity against the Turkish Muslims population. And today we are going to discuss why do many countries remain silent on this human rights atrocity. First of all, I would like to welcome to all distinguished speakers, Mr. Omer Kanat, Executive Director of Uyghur Human Rights Project. Welcome, Mr. Omer Kanat. Are you positioned in Washington or in others?
In Virginia, so
okay,
close to Washington area. Yes.
Thank you very much. Welcome. And also we do have here Professor James Leibold, Professor of Politics and ASEAN Study at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. Welcome, Mr. James.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.
Also from Srinagar, Kashmir, Dr. Aizat Wani, Research Fellow at Observer Research Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Ayaz Wani. And
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we do have two distinguished speakers also from Jakarta. Dr. Dina Wisnu, former member of ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and a lecturer at Binus University, Jakarta. Welcome, Dr. Dina.
Thank you very much. I recently changed my last name, so.
Okay.
Dina Praptoraharja. Thank you.
Dina Praptoraharja. Sorry about that. And also the familiar face, Mr. Feramala Anjaya, Senior Research Fellow of CSEAS Jakarta. Ladies and gentlemen, the first speaker is Mr. Omer Kanat, and then followed by Professor James Leibold and Dr. Dina and Dr. Ayaz, and also the last one is Mr. Anjaya. Let me introduce first Dr. Kanat. Allow me to share the short bio. Let me read it for us today. Mr. Omer is Executive Director of Uyghur Human Rights Project, Human Rights Research and Advocacy Organization based in Washington, D.C., U.S. He has 2 decades of experience as a broadcast journalist. From 1999 to 2009, Mr. Kanat was senior editor at Radio Free Asia's Uyghur Service, where he covered the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. edited Uyghur language news, conducted exclusive interview with prominent figures in Inner Asia, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also reported on breaking news around the world. Prior to his work at Radio Free Asia, he was editor and later senior editor at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Tajik Service. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Omer Kanat for next 20 minutes to deliver your view and presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for hosting this very important event. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you on China's atrocity on Uyghur Muslim people. I would like to give some background and an overview of recent developments in my homeland and the international response to it. Also, I would like to first to give talk about a little bit about my organization, what my organization does. The Uyghur Human Rights Project was founded by Uyghurs in 2003. We needed at the time to fill a huge gap. All the mainstream human rights organizations published almost nothing on the terrible human rights abuses in our homeland, East Turkestan. Since then, we have released more than 90 reports and briefings based on international human rights standards in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the major UN human rights treaties and covenants. Some of our reports, report summaries are available in Bahasa, Indonesian. Please contact me if you would like to like the links. Yeah. So I'm a Uyghur. Uyghurs are Turkic Muslim people. They have a rich culture and history. Uyghurs call their homeland East Turkestan. Chinese government calls it Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The region is very rich in natural resources, and Uyghurs have close cultural and linguistic ties with the neighboring Central Asian nations. These ties are the fundamental reason the CCP sees Uyghur cultural identity as a threat and has implemented policies which seek to eliminate it as rapidly as possible. East Turkestan is also politically and economically strategic in China's push for global influence and economic power. The CCP seized the control of the region, East Turkestan, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, in 1949. Policies in the region have been long repressive. We experience political repression, economic discrimination, and cultural erasure. However, these repression worsened in 2010s, and since 2017, escalating to the point where they met criteria of the Genocide Convention. The most shocking elements of this campaign is the network of camps, which have swept up enormous numbers of people. Reasonable estimates put it at 1.8 up to 3 million people. Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims from all walks of the life being targeted, religious leaders, intellectuals, scholars, students, teachers, artists, farmers, and business people. Conditions in the camps are unspeakable: starvation, diet, dehydration, overcrowding, and lack of medical care. Camp survivors have testified to horrific torture, including rape, forced sterilization, death, and suicide. detainees forced to renounce their religion, culture, and take unknown medication. Actually, renouncing religion is the first thing that detainees being forced to do in the camps. But Uyghurs outside of the camps are also subjected to a totalitarian police state and systematic attacks on their religion, language, and families. In addition to the massive buildup of security forces in the region, authorities have been using every high-tech tool at their disposal to surveil the entire population, including a blanket of cameras and other tracking devices, in a system which analyzes people's contacts and behavior to determine whether they are a threat. This capability should be a concern to everyone, not only people living under the Chinese communist authoritarian rule. Uyghurs are also monitored through sending Communist Party members into their homes to politically assess them. Over 1 million Han Chinese officials regularly eat and sleep with the Uyghur families in the so-called homestay program. What has happened to the children of the detainees? The Chinese government has taken hundreds of thousands of Uyghur children away from their parents, their grandparents, or other relatives, and put them into state-run facilities where they are subjected to political indoctrination. They are forbidden to speak their own language and never see their relatives. The governments call them, of course, boarding schools. Expressing religious faith is one of the primary reasons people are sent to the camps. Everyday practices are dope extremism, and victims report that indoctrination in the camps focuses eliminating faith in Islam. Houses are searched for religious items such as prayer rags and even Qurans. Some people were sent to the camps for attending weddings or funerals with traditional religious elements, or any contact with the foreign countries or visit to foreign countries, especially Muslim countries. Refusing to marry a Han Chinese man or greeting each other with traditional Uyghur greeting, Assalamu alaikum, or going to Hajj. The authorities attempt to eliminate Islam are affecting all of Uyghur society, even going so far as to ban Islamic names such as Muhammad and Fatima in 2018, making it illegal to give these names to children and forcing some to change their names. People are sentenced to 10 or 15 years in prison simply for praying. Kalbanur Ghani, who lives in Virginia, found out that her sister, Rana Gul, had been sentenced to 17 years in prison for observing religious rites after the death of their father and for keeping religious books in her possession. Outside of the camps, mosques have been shut down, with many hundreds demolished, along with cemeteries and shrines. According to Australian Strategic Policy Institute, since 2017, 16,000 mosques have been fully or partially demolished or had architectural features removed. The lack of response from Muslim world has been demoralizing for the Uyghurs. The leadership of many Muslim majority countries have been silent, while others vocally approve the Chinese government's actions and cooperate with their request to return Uyghurs to where they will certainly face detention, torture, and imprisonment, and even death. There is also a massive program of state-imposed forced labor. It doesn't matter if you are a teacher or farmer or a student or business owner, you are forced to work in a food processing, garment factories, and production of components for solar panels. Forced sterilization, forced abortion, and forced birth control measures have meant that the Uyghur birth rate dropped by almost 50% between 2017 and 2019. The Uyghur Human Rights Project will soon release a report about the government program to pressure Uyghur girls and women to marry Han Chinese men. This is a cruel policy of human trafficking and ethnic eradication. Uyghur Human Rights Project recently released a report on 312 prominent Uyghur intellectuals who have been imprisoned or disappeared in a targeted campaign of eliticide. We published a report confirming that over 1,000 Uyghur imams and religious figures have been detained or imprisoned. It is, of course, only the tip of the iceberg. The real number is much, much higher. Another Uyghur Human Rights report, Human Rights Project report covered in a Wall Street Journal exclusive, found that the Chinese government has secretly given long prison sentences to Uyghur entrepreneurs and confiscated their assets. But the Chinese government's pursuit of Uyghur does not stop at Chinese border. It is conducting a comprehensive program of transnational repression. That includes threats, smears, taking family members as hostage, black renditions, and forcing Uyghurs to become informers in other countries. The government has created a secret interrogation center in Dubai where Uyghurs are taken who have tried to travel through Dubai. We documented 372 known cases of refoulement, illegal deportation of Uyghurs to China, where they face certain detention, torture, or worse. An independent tribunal heard 7 days of testimony last year in London on all these issues. After many hours of witness and survivor testimony and expert analysis of hundreds of pages of leaked Chinese government documents, the Uyghur Tribunal issued its final judgment on December 23, 2021. The tribunal found that this is genocide. The US government and parliaments of several countries have condemned it as genocide in crimes against humanity. But unfortunately, many countries, of course, many countries, especially Muslim majority countries, are silent or support Chinese government's genocidal policy toward Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in East Turkestan. Chinese government is using heavy financial and diplomatic pressure on neighboring governments to ensure that they stay silent on or support their policies. And the Chinese government is also very successful in suppressing news from reaching these societies. Of course, I want to say that although the governments in Muslim majority countries are either silent or support, even praise Chinese government's treatment of Uyghurs, Muslims around the world are outraged, of course, and once they know what is happening to the Uyghur people. So I would like to hear from the rest of the webinar participants what helps the general public realize what's happening, what motivates parliaments, especially in Muslim majority countries, to hold hearings, to publish reports, and not to give up on pressuring their governments to stop turning a blind eye to Chinese genocide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Omer Kanat, from details of presentation on atrocity of Chinese government against the Uyghurs. And we do understand recent report, even from international media, expose what so-called is look like the the prisoners in the large scales. And I believe it's this crime against humanity is still happens today. And this is why we are very important, as Mr. Omer Kanat said, to discuss this matter, to put attention the world to this the flight of Uyghur in modern era, in globalized era. Today we should have attention. Next speaker, Mr. James Label. I would like to introduce first Omer Kanat, speaking from Virginia, and now we are going to Melbourne, Australia. So this is really the webinar among the countries from very, very far place from Indonesia. Mr. James Label, I would like to read some short bio of Mr. James. Is a professor of politics and ASEAN studies at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. He is also non-resident senior fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra, where he leads the Xinjiang Data Project. He is the author of 50 peer-reviewed books, articles, and book chapters on ethnicity, race, and nationalism in modern China. His books include the Minority Education in China, co-edited with Chen Yangbin, also Ethnic Policy in China, Critical Hand Studies, and the other book is Reconfiguring Chinese Nationalism. Please welcome James, Professor James Label, for presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. I want to thank the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for convening this webinar and for reaching out and trying to expand the global discussion about what's happening in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. As mentioned in my bio, in addition to my role at La Trobe University, I'm also the head of the Xinjiang Data Project at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It's ASPI, as it's known, as an independent think tank based in Canberra. And under the Xinjiang Data Project, we brought together a range of authoritative, empirically driven research reports to document the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. We got reports that look at major aspects of the Chinese government's crackdown. I really encourage you, if you have time, to visit the website where you can read the reports. The website is available in Bahasa Malay as well as Bahasa Indonesian. I'm just going to briefly touch on some of the key issues today and don't have time to go into any detail, but all the information is there for anyone who's interested. In my really brief remarks today, I want to touch on three big questions. First, briefly, what's happening in Xinjiang. Second, I want to look at the question of how we got to here. And then finally, I'll come to that question of why the majority of the Muslim world is largely silent on the repression in Xinjiang. So first, to begin with the question of sort of what is happening in Xinjiang. Well, in my framing of or analysis of what is occurring, I think it's best seen as a colonial project. So since the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, the founding of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party has embarked upon a colonial project in Xinjiang, or the so-called New Frontier, that really seeks to secure the party's sovereignty over the region, but also to transform its landscape and indigenous population in its own image. This colonial project has really intensified since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, 2013. The colonial intent of these policies seeks to ultimately transform, not exterminate, I would argue, the physical and social landscape of Xinjiang. And not only of Xinjiang, but also other peripheral regions like Inner Mongolia, Tibet, and even Hong Kong today. Well, I think it's really important to debate the legality and responsibility of the Chinese Communist Party under international law, whether or not their policies equate to genocide or crimes against humanity. I personally have found it better to think about it both normatively and comparatively in terms of a colonial project. These policies, as I said before, really seek to kind of recast the region and its indigenous population in the image of the Han ethnic majority. The project involves a range of really interconnected policy drivers, many of which Mr. Omar Kant discussed in great detail, and his organization's done a lot of really important research documenting many of these policies. Just to summarize really briefly, some of the key aspects that many people will be familiar with is the massed extrajudicial internment of possibly 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities in prison-like re-education camps, really from 2016 well into 2020. The really pervasive, highly intrusive surveillance, both in terms of automated forms as well as human forms, that really mean party officials now literally monitor Uyghurs in their own homes, if not in their own beds. There's the systematic erasure of indigenous language, culture, and religious practices. In our ASPE report, Cultural Erasure, we looked at the destruction of mosques, pilgrimage sites, as well as traditional cemeteries. There's a range of new population controls that are essentially aimed at diluting the size and concentration of the indigenous population in southern Xinjiang. So here we're looking at both forms of coercive birth control targeted at Uyghurs, as well as the inward migration of Han Chinese through the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. So again, in our ASPE report, Family D-Planning, we documented using a novel methodology the 50% decline of birth rates in indigenous majority counties in southern Xinjiang. Finally, you have well, two related aspects. You have a kind of dramatic increase in the informal incarceration of Uyghurs and other minorities. Around 2000, there was an effort to mothball the re-education camps and put those who were deemed to be immune to re-education in formal incarceration, while others were placed into forced labor assignments across Xinjiang, as well as the rest of China, in the name of poverty alleviation. So what we're seeing is a really systematic colonial project that has seen a tremendous amount of resources, both at the central government as well as the Xinjiang level, all the way down to the county and even the township level, aimed again to systematically transform the indigenous population as well as the territory of Xinjiang. So to my next question, sort of how did we get here? Well, first, I think it's really important to point out that that this wasn't inevitable. If we look at China's rich and long history, we can see periods of time when China was incredibly diverse, open, and cosmopolitan. Take, for example, the Tang Dynasty. Yet we can also find times when it was homogeneous, insular, and highly combative, if not xenophobic. Take, for example, the Ming Dynasty and the rebuilding of the Great Wall of China to keep the barbarians at bay. So across the millennium, Chinese tradition has adopted really a range of different approaches for dealing with ethnocultural diversity and people who weren't like the vast majority of the Chinese people. Let me just briefly touch on three of these approaches to give you a sense of some of the diversity of the way in which China in the past has dealt with that. The first is that of the tradition of jimi, or loose reins, literally like talking about the reins of a horse. to not chomp down too hard on the bit, leaving the barbarian alone or buying off its elite in the pursuit of peace, believing that essentially the barbarians were of a different essence and were best left alone on the other side of the Great Wall. So a very passive, accommodating approach. Another approach is emboldened by the Chinese concept of Lai Hui, which literally means to come and be transformed. It was defined by the belief in the superiority of the Chinese cultural tradition and its way of life, and a belief that the barbarians would kind of naturally be drawn in willfully, voluntarily transform themselves in the image of Chinese culture. Finally, a third approach was that of what the Chinese call ronghe, or fusion, a belief that the Chinese state and its elites needed to actively transform the barbarian in its own image. You might call this the Han man's burden, a kind of civilizing mission aimed at going out into the frontier and transforming it in its lands in the image of the Chinese state. So we can find moments when all three of these approaches were used during the course of the history of the PRC. The loose reins approach really dominated during the 1950s and again during the 1980s. The chauvinism behind the Han man's burden was on show during the Cultural Revolution. And finally, under Chinese President Xi Jinping, we've seen a return to this idea of ronghe, or the active fusing of different people into a single national body. One of the key concepts of ethnic policy in theory under Xi Jinping is this idea of forging the collective consciousness of the Chinese nation or race. This key phrase has been written into the party doctrine. And a key part of it in my analysis is this verb, zhulao, which can be translated as to cast or to forge. It suggests that the party can no longer take a kind of laissez-faire approach to nation building, but rather needs to be actively involved in transforming the identities, the cultures, the languages of ethnic minority peoples. The party state and its Han-dominated leadership are kind of like the stonemasons that are actively transforming the physical landscape and human geography of the frontier. And these acts of forging really go well beyond Xinjiang. You can think of Xinjiang maybe as the pointy end of a very long arrow that has worked its way through Lhasa to Holhat, from Kashgar to Hong Kong. And so I think we can learn a lot by thinking about this in a kind of a wider comparative framework by looking at what the Communist Party has done in Tibet in the past, or what it's seeking to do in Hong Kong today. Finally, I'll just turn to the last question, the kind of key theme of this webinar, and I'm so pleased to see the Center for Southeast Asian Studies grappling with this issue. Is sort of why has most of the Muslim world remained largely silent on the plight of the Uyghurs? Again, I think there's no simple or single answer here, but rather a range of factors at play that maybe I'll sketch out what I think are kind of three of the most important ones. And hopefully in discussion, we can interrogate these a little bit further. The first is what I believe is an active campaign of disinformation on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. So the party initially, after satellite imagery came out demonstrating the existence of these re-education camps, the party for almost 18 months remained silent, denying their existence. But beginning in August 2018, the party and its massive propaganda apparatuses really went on the front foot and into overdrive. They sought to sow both and disinformation internationally as well as domestically. The Chinese Communist Party has been actively creating a counter narrative about a benign and enlightened project aimed at combating violent extremism and terrorism in Xinjiang by painting and mounting evidence of this benign policy. It also seeks to cast anybody who criticizes China as actively peddling mischievous lies and even fake news. And by doing this, what the Chinese Communist Party has effectively done is create a narrative of plausible deniability behind which international actors can seek shelter if they find it inconvenient to criticize China. So that's the first aspect of this CCP propaganda campaign. Second, I think there is a genuine knowledge gap. I would argue that there is simply less information available about what is happening in Xinjiang and to the Uyghur people in the media and social media landscape of the Muslim world. I was just doing a bit of very crude analysis this morning, looking first at the Jakarta Post as opposed to the Australian, so two of the largest English language dailies in Indonesia and Australia. And if you simply do a Google search for articles on Xinjiang, you see 326 in the Jakarta Post and double that, 744 in the Australian. And of course, if you then factor in the language gap, so looking at the Jakarta Post is probably not really representative. So then I went and looked at Kampas, the largest Bahasa Indonesian newspaper. And there I found only 9 articles with the keyword of Xinjiang. And some of them were clear pieces of mis and disinformation. So I would suggest that we'd find similar results if we looked at other parts of the Muslim world, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, etc. Finally, the last aspect, I think, is that of economic coercion. Now, countries like Australia that have really spoken out and criticized the Chinese Communist Party for its abusive policies in Xinjiang have been subjected to the full weight of the Chinese Communist Party's coercive economic diplomacy. Like Australia, many countries in the Muslim world, like Indonesia, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, have China as their top trading partner. And I would suggest it's out of acts of political expediency that many of these countries, their political and business elites, decide to remain silent with regards to the plight of the Uyghurs. Take, for example, Indonesian President Jokowi, who claimed ignorance when he was asked about what was happening in Xinjiang by the Financial Times in 2019. More recently, to a question from Bloomberg, he made some kind of really odd comment about democracy and Islam proceeding at parallel. Or more bluntly, we can always thank Tun Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia, the former prime minister, who was quite frank in his comments about what was happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, stating in 2019 that him and other Malaysian elites have been silent because, quote, China is a very powerful nation, unquote. So being quite frank about the fact that for Malaysia, possibly for Indonesia and other Muslim countries, there is a need to brush this issue under the rug, keep silent on this issue, as in order not to damage the political and economic relationship these countries have with China. So I'll leave my remarks there, and I look forward to engaging in discussion as well as hearing the remarks of the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor James. It's believed 10:30 p.m. in Melbourne. It's already at the night. So we continue discussion, but I just want to note from Professor James' statement that it seems that in Xinjiang area against Uyghur is what so-called is systematic colonial projects. This is what Omer Khanat explains, the atrocity, crime against humanity. It seems that the other perspective, it's happened that it seems look like the colonialism or colonial projects happen in that area against Uyghur, and also why the response is very low, even from the Muslim country, as Mr. Omer Khanat said, that because of disinformation, active campaign. and also very small attention. Professor James give the very clear, cue from media Jakarta Post and Kompas how this what so-called is a knowledge gap in Muslim world. Let's continue from Melbourne. We are going to see the next speaker is from Srinagar, Rivaldi, Mr. Dr. Ayazwani. Please, I would like to introduce first Dr. Ayazwani is Research Fellow at ORF Mumbai. He is currently working on project Kashmir Conflict Managing Perception and Prospects for Peace. Designed in the form of questionnaires and survey with key stakeholders, the project is based on the Kashmir Youth Perspective. Wani also tracks the minorities of China, Uyghur, radicalization in Pakistan and Greater Central Asia. He is widely published in international and national peer-reviewed journals. He has received fellowship from Xinjiang Social Science Academy in Urumqi, Xinjiang, and the University Grants Commission, New Delhi. Wani is also UK's fellow from, he undertook 2-year program, the European Union and Central Asia in International System. I would like to request Dr. Ayazwani from Srinagar now to speak in this forum.
Thank you. I am thanking the hosts as well as Umar Kant and Professor Lebord that they have opened the discussion and that make my discussion easy, because I will be stressing on why Muslim countries, especially the Muslim countries in Middle East as well as Muslim countries in South Asia and Central Asia, remain silent on this issue that is more of an importance. Can you please share my PPT? Yeah, next. Yeah. China has so far detained, according to reports, 1 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps for forced re-education and political indoctrination. But problem is that West major Muslim countries have defended or even welcomed the policy. But on the other side, USA and other Western democracies like EU and for example Australia, New Zealand, they have deplored the Chinese actions, especially the actions of CCP after 1 million Uyghurs were sent to concentration camps. Even some countries, USA and others, enacted series of measures including the imposition of broad and targeted economic sanctions against senior CCP officials. Even sometimes imports from China, which were done from Xinjiang, were banned. And officially they have said that they are doing genocide. But however, Beijing has been successful to influence the Muslim world to toe to its line at all global forums on matters related to Uyghur Muslims and their deplorable conditions. Major Muslim countries either remained silent or some even endorsed Beijing's actions, and many Muslim countries detained Uyghurs who were in exile and repatriated them to China. Next. The first thing we see that China experienced decades of unprecedented growth after the end of Cold War. And this excessive production of manufacturing things like iron, steel, cement, aluminum, that was used by CCP to convert it into an opportunity by moving out this our capacity on the basis of China development strategies abroad and foreign policy. And on these basis, BRI was formed. Belt and Road Initiative was initiated in 2013. And that Belt and Road Initiative was not only a geopolitical, geo-economic, or geostrategic project, but it was also to use this excessive production within the mainland China for infrastructure purposes. Next. Changing scenario. What happened? One is Belt and Road Initiative was initiated in 2013 in Kazakhstan. It became Xinjiang, became the gateway to South Asia, to Central Asia, to Eurasia. And Xinjiang became natural and cultural hub of these activities, the geostrategic and geoeconomic activities. But, however, Xinjiang has witnessed contested history, and Chinese imperial powers maintained full control over it only about in 425 years till 1949. It is written by Owen Latimer, who has written a lot on this area during 1940s, 50s. And Xinjiang became, because of this colonial control of only 425 years, Xinjiang became hotbed of centrifugal tendencies because of their cultural intimacy towards Central Asia as well as towards South Asia. I have been there, I know their culture, I have been there for 1 year and I have remained lived there. So they are much more culturally attuned towards Central Asia or South Asia. Now, one is BRI was included in the constitution. Subsequently, President Xi Jinping called for building Great Wall of Iron to protect China's national unity and solidarity in the troubled Xinjiang province. So it was actually to minimize security threats in Xinjiang. Next. Now, after 2017, what Xi Jinping started, what CCP started? Repressive sensitization, high-tech surveillance, re-education camps, socio-economic exploitation of indigenous Uyghurs, detention camps for forced re-education, political indoctrination, illegal organ harvesting, targeting Uyghur women through abortions, forcefully hitting them with IUDs, etc. So this cultural prosecution of Uyghurs that actually started after the Communist Revolution of 1949 was what I mean to say, got transformed into a genocide after Xi Jinping came to power. And stance of Western democracies on this issue, including economic sanctions on CCP officials, that remained intact. But somehow we can see this Xinjiang model that became after 2017, the Xinjiang model that was started by Xi Jinping, we see its replication in the neighboring countries like Pakistan and Central Asian countries. Next. Now, why Muslim world remained silent? That is the bigger question. Even though Western democracies criticized it, called it genocide, and implemented some sanctions on the Chinese officials, one is namaz was made illegal religious activity. Uyghurs were fined for performing their basic religious duty. Ban on headscarves and religious clothing was done for both men and women. Muslim countries that unite and deplore such action in any part of the world have remained silent. Muslim countries, on the contrary, have helped China at global forums and are hand in glove with China when it comes to transnational repression of Uyghurs. Next. See, since 2017, 682 Uyghurs have been detained in Egypt, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Qatar, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Tajikistan, Thailand, Turkey, and UAE, and Uzbekistan. Egypt detained 2,200 Uyghurs, and they were deported to China. In Central Asian countries, 150 students were deported. Pakistan also made 50 cases of illegal detention. Malaysia, 11 deported till 2012, and still they are deporting. even though it did not become a news because they deport now them silently. Saudi Arabia also did the same. Turkey, the second home of Uyghurs, they till that have deported more than 250 Uyghurs, and they detained them and then sent back them to China. Next. See, here I have made a table because I am writing on Xinjiang from law 2009. I have done my PhD on it. See, now the Muslim countries, most of the Muslim countries have signed extradition treaty with China, and the countries which have detained or extradited Uyghurs to China, and they also signed the signatory letter to UN that what China is doing in Xinjiang is good. Next. Now, the causes why Muslim countries are endorsing Chinese policy in Xinjiang. First factor is most of the Muslim countries, barring Malaysia, are authoritative in nature. See the democracy index. Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE categorized as 21 most authoritarian regimes in the world. Human Freedom Index of 2019. Turkey, Egypt, Bahrain showed dramatic deteriorations of personal freedoms. And most Muslim countries are guilty of unlawful killings, arbitrary arrests, forced detentions, disappearances, and torture of prisoners and detainees. Poor human rights records of Muslim countries often support Western democracy to pursue intervention policies. The intervention policies of the Western democracies are in stark contrast to the Beijing. Beijing tries to have relation with Muslim nations that is based on mutual respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in the other's internal matters, affairs, equality, and mutual benefit. Next. The second thing China used is the BRI investments and loans to tame Muslim countries. Here in the table, see China's investments after the launch of BRI until 2018 in $1 billion in Muslim countries. Saudi Arabia, $14 billion, UAE, $21 billion, Iran, $13 billion, Egypt, Algeria, Pakistan, $62 billion under proposed CPEC. Turkey also got a loan of $3.6 billion in 2010, and in 2015, China invested more $3 billion in Turkey. Now, on the other side, they signed comprehensive strategic partnership and strategic partnership treaties with China. Second thing, they used the oil diplomacy. In 2019, China imported more than $40 billion, that $40 billion oil from Saudi Arabia, $16 billion oil from Oman, $7.3 billion from United Arab Emirates, and $7 billion from Iran, and $5.5 billion from Malaysia. Now, the poor countries, Muslim countries, were given loans, and the richer countries, where Chinese officials used the oil diplomacy to tame them, to use them as a tool on international forum. Next. Now, another cause that helped China to make their disinformation campaign more vital in Islamic world. They managed the perception of Muslim leaders whosoever visited China by Chinese Islamic Association. West was busy in bashing Muslims and Islamic world after 9/11 terror attack. That gave rise to Islamophobia in West, especially during Trump era. Trump, during his presidency, also banned the citizens of 7 Muslim countries for 90 days and blocked entry of Syrian refugees. Trump's unlimited support to Israel and intimidation, coercion of Palestine by cutting down $200 million aid also angered Muslim countries. On the other hand, the Arab Uprising that started after 2011 saw dramatic and direct outreach of political Islam between China, Russia, and several Muslim countries in West Asia. The wave of political Islam and mass mobilization that swept through the Muslim world since 2011 created existential threat to ruling authoritative regimes in the region. While Western media portrayed the Saudi UAE-Egypt axis as a more substantial threat to global peace, stability, and liberal values than the radical forces. So Beijing and Russia, what they did during that period, they deepened their religious engagement with the Saudi UAE-Egypt axis to help these countries to establish state-controlled religious discourse, much like they have developed in their own countries. For example, and on the basis of this political Islam, after 2017, they used the same discourse of political Islam to detain more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Thus, 30% of the 33 other countries sent a letter to the UN to defend Chinese actions in Xinjiang. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Qatar also were the signatory of that letter. Growing concerns about the political Islam within the Muslim world helped China to break the Middle East bent towards American unipolarity and established greater multipolarity, internal diplomatic and economic and military engagement with the region. Internally, Beijing used Chinese Islamic Association and APEC's government body that was started in 1960 to look after Islamic discourse and religious activity within and outside Xinjiang for perception management. For example, next, please, next slide. After Urumqi riots of 2019, the OIC sent an official fact-finding delegation to Beijing and Xinjiang, headed by Ambassador Sayyid Qasim Al-Maraisi, advisor to USC and former envoy of Egypt to Saudi Arabia. Once he went to Xinjiang, he was only given permission to meet Chinese Islamic Association officials in Xinjiang in a guided tour. So Chinese Islamic Association guided or misinformed him about the situation in Xinjiang. Similarly, after Kunming attack of 2014, the CIA, Chinese Islamic Association, hosted an Islamic conference in Xinjiang that was attended by many Islamic scholars. Same happened in 2016. Now, in 2019, what they did when they sent their delegations to other Muslim countries, they applauded the exchange programs with other Muslim countries and their universities. Al-Azhar University of Egypt. CIA was also present during the visit of King Salman of Saudi Arabia in 2014 and also during the visit of Turkish President Erdogan. So CIA always, Chinese Islamic always misinformed the Islamic countries and their rulers and organized guided tours to mosques and other Islamic centers wherever any Muslim ruler visited China, especially from Middle East, Pakistan, Iran, or Turkey. Such is the perception management of CIA that forced King Salman to donate 3 million for the construction of Islamic cultural centers in China. Next. Now, another tool what China used is Islamic banking. China also exploited Islamic banking system in the Muslim countries through BRI, because 30 major Muslim countries have joined BRI, and Beijing has exploited the Sharia principles of Islamic finance. The Sharia prohibits the earning interest on loans, bars funding activities involving alcohol, pornography, or gambling. In 2016, Full Goal Asset Management in Hong Kong partnered with Milward Finance of UAE under the Sharia principle. HNA Group, which owns the well-known Henan Airlines, borrowed $150 million from Islamic countries in 2015. The Islamic
time 2 minutes more, Mr.
Yeah. Next slide. Now, I will directly come on conclusion. Economically indebted to China and towing China's strategy of political Islam, some Muslim countries in South Asia like Pakistan, Bangladesh have turned a blind eye to the atrocities of Muslims in Xinjiang. BRI investments and loans have been used to suppress the Uyghur diaspora in the Muslim countries, which I have shown earlier in one of the tables, with many states coerced to sign extradition treaties and deport Uyghur exiles to Chinese mainland. China has made deep inroads into Muslim world and wealthy West Asian nations. China has exercised energy diplomacy, signed long-term investments in oil, and leveraged domestic political uncertainties in these countries to secure their silence on Uyghur issue. While Chinese Islamic Association has managed the perception of Islamic rulers, Islamic banking practices earned Beijing their respect. Now, Trump's American first policy, anti-Muslim rhetoric, and moves like withdrawing from Iran nuclear deal have fueled these sentiments. This allowed China to proceed unchecked with its Xinjiang strategy within the Muslim world. Now, the way forward. The US-led Western democracies and like-minded countries need to invest and reform their policies towards Muslim world to regain their trust and halt it. That will be one of the most important factors to halt China's coercive, assertive, hegemonic pursuits. And this will not only help to save the persecuted Muslim minorities in China, especially Uyghurs, but it will also help to contain Beijing's global ambitions that is based on their hegemonic pursuit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayaz Wani, speaking from Srinagar, Kashmir, India. Dr. Ayaz emphasizes not only active campaign, as Mr. Professor James labeled, the policy of China, also engage in economic activity and financials, particularly with the Muslim countries. So this is also make it very difficult. The Muslim country position on Xinjiang's, what happened in Xinjiang, particularly what happens, the atrocity and crime against humanity to Uyghur recently. Let's see, now we are going back to Jakarta to hear Dina Prapto Raharja PhD. Let me introduce first Mbak Dina. This is was known as Dina Wisnu. Of course, she is familiar with Dina Wisnu. Now Dina Prapto Raharja. She is a senior public policy advisor, a tenor associate professor in international relations at Binus University in Jakarta, and a certified lecturer registered to the Indonesian Ministry of National Education. Her specialization is diplomacy, public policy, and social protection. In international relations, Dina is active in teaching diplomats at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, participating in tracks of formal diplomatic activities, including when she was appointed to represent Indonesia in the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, 2016 to 2018. She has been involved in preparing the annual Bali Civil Society and Media Forum that is now an integral part of Bali Democracy Forum since 2018. She also carried the issue of design work for various sectors, She was a member of the expert team in the task force of the combat syndicates of illegal sending Indonesian migrants. And since July 2021, is also appointed to chair the division to prevent and protect Indonesian migrants in destination country. Ms. Dina Praptorajo, please deliver your speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your generous introduction, Pak Asep. And good afternoon, everyone from Jakarta. Greetings and best wishes to all panelists and participants. Great to see you today, though only through Zoom. And thank you to the Center of Southeast Asian Studies for bringing us together, allowing me to learn different views. We have very sharp speakers ahead of me have already spoken. I agree that this is an important talk on the atrocities of Muslim people. Wait up. I'm trying to set the clock as well. Just relax. And so indeed, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies asked a very pungent questions on why do many countries remain silent. So I'm sure your next question will be, what's wrong with China? What's wrong with the world? What's wrong with Muslim world? And what's wrong with Indonesia as well? As I ask myself, why can't we do much? So as a caveat, I have to tell you that I only learned about Uyghur since 2019, so not long ago compared to some of the other speakers here. I may be the least to understand exactly what has been going on inside of Xinjiang and to the Uyghur people. But I do follow this issue, and I'm claiming no superiority of knowledge, but I think this is a very good opportunity to speak about the patterns at the international level of how issues like Uyghur has been handled. So I'm going to talk about the three patterns of narratives on how Uyghurs is seen by China and the rest of the world. And then with my specialty in comparative politics, I would like to discuss aspects of atrocities toward Uyghurs. And I see some similarities with the case of Rohingyas in Myanmar, for instance. And see, at the end, I will take some opportunity to see how solidarity among us, the non-government individuals, can push and pressure our governments to make a difference. So, as some of the previous speakers have mentioned, Xinjiang means new frontier. It is indeed a frontier. And if I look at the map of Xinjiang, I can see how it is a frontier to the northwest of China. It borders not just one or two countries, but 8 countries, Mongolia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And Xinjiang province, as part of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. As you can see, it is located in a very strategic location. It may be deep in the heart of China and Central Asia, but it is an important passage area for many people going to Europe, Russia, Asia, and who knows which part of other worlds you can go through that route. The Kashgar Prefecture in the southwestern part of Xinjiang was known historically as well as a trading center between a vast desert and mountain range. It may be isolated, but it is an oasis in a long trade of route across the Asian continent. So it's very interesting to note that as a passage area, of course, you see different kinds of culture being together in that area. In Xinjiang alone, there are 20 different languages. At least that's what I found in some of the previous studies. Different culture existed for centuries in Xinjiang, and Uyghur is only one of the language and culture in Xinjiang. And Uyghur, as a race group, lives not only in China, actually, that's what I learned, but also they live in Central Asia, as for instance, in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and some estimated number of 12.8 million Uyghur are in China. So that's quite a large number. Some says that genetically they are a mixture of Caucasian and East Asian, light-colored, skin hair. In terms of religion, they are primarily Sunni Muslims. They look like this. So in short, the Uyghur may be large enough in number compared to the population of some Southeast Asian countries. But of course, if you juxtapose them in terms of number compared to the giant number of the Chinese Han, they are a minority. The Uyghurs live on top of fertile soil and rich natural resources, mining area in particular, over 122 kinds of mineral is there, not to mention oil and gas production. But it was mentioned as one of the poorest provinces in China. So back in 2017, if we look at the data reports coming from Xinjiang, poverty range rate may go as high as 25% in parts of Xinjiang. UNICEF, for instance, back in 2017, declared Xinjiang as the highest poverty rate in China, more than Tibet and Yunnan. And they mentioned particularly the number of villages that are poor. But now, if you look through, check the poverty status of Xinjiang, you'd find news and reports, mostly from the Chinese government though, that's the caveat, saying that Xinjiang is making progress in consolidating poverty alleviation. Millions of jobs are reported to be provided for rural laborers. Labor-intensive industries are being built. People now have access to stable income, and the government services are able to reach the villages. So it's interesting how James, for instance, linked that with the Colonial Project of China, for instance. But for China sees this as a history, grand history of eliminating poverty in the deep part of China. They said in one of the statements of their high-ranking officials that the achievement of making Xinjiang out of poverty is much more impressive than in African countries. And of course, so that's the keywords right there. So number one, the perspective that I can get from this angle is that how Uyghur is seen by China and by the rest of the world as from its development perspective. So economic development is badly needed there. They need to turn the poverty around. And so the CCP, or the Communist Party of China, can say development is the absolute principle. So it's like a slap in our face if we complain about situation in Uyghur, because they would say that, do you mind if they become more prosperous? So that's one perspective of it. The next, if I look through again to the tracking the atrocities to the Uyghur, I can see that since the 1990s, the region of Xinjiang in northwest China had witnessed a very bad forced incarceration of the Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim. They call it camps for re-education. But for whatever it is, I see this as a very bad actions. There are no other words to describe such actions as against human beings. It's unacceptable, and it classifies as a crime against humanity, everything that has mentioned by my previous speakers. Because if we look closer at the definition of atrocities, even if they don't end in killings, they are extremely wicked and cruel act, typically involving physical violence or injury. And atrocities are forms of crimes that may exterminate someone at the end. It may create mass murder, even if they were just fetus, enslavement, torture, forced sexual acts. And of course, eventually, if all of this doesn't end, all of this aggression, prosecution, disappearance may end in genocide. So if we look at the definition of genocide, all of the elements can start be found in the case of Uyghur. Furthermore, we know that internationally there are other United Nations conventions speaking about how unacceptable atrocities like this are. There are the UN Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. There is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, UN Convention against the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, the Geneva Conventions for the international legal standards for humanitarian treatment, even if we call it war, which is not, and Rome Statute. So in principle, there are international agreements that would constitute crimes against humanity. A few things to realize though. Atrocities involve coordinated acts by the state or by authorities, those who are in charge. So there needs to be a proof when we say there's a coordinated act by the state. And usually there will be contending narrative, therefore, on what has been going on. Before that happened, the state would create its own narrative so that what they do is looking legitimate. Atrocities involve state authority can actually be tried in the ICC, International Criminal Court. But one needs to be a member in order for the court to open an investigation into a country's allegation of crime. The court doesn't have jurisdiction over non-members. Now, China signed and ratified most of the core international human rights treaties and conventions, from racial discrimination, discrimination against women, apartheid, refugees, genocide, torture. They signed it, but they're not becoming the party of the ICC. And China is not alone. The US is also not a member of the ICC. And so is Israel, India, Myanmar, and some more. And I have to say, Indonesia too is not party of the ICC and has yet to ratify the Statute of Rome. So there's the second pattern I'm saying here. The second one is protecting sovereignty. Countries have concerns and interest to protect their own sovereignty. Conventions may be signed, they may be ratified, but all of those do not matter if not enough countries voice protest upon violation of those conventions. The most recent case in point is the United Nations General Assembly meeting back in October 2021, where there were actually two joint statements from two lines of countries about Xinjiang. One sponsored by France, supported by 43 countries, mostly European and North American countries. Another sponsored by Cuba and supported by 62 countries from Middle East, Russia, Pakistan, African countries. So one condemns China, the other one supports China. So this is what hasn't been told by the previous speakers. Where would you be as a sovereign country in such polarized situation? If you're an investor, I bet you would prioritize cooperation from those who can protect your business to maintain your business, sustainability of your business. Unfortunately, oftentimes you would rely on the government with the more massive power to suppress dissenting voices. We've seen many multinational corporations operating in these areas who says nothing about all of this. And yet they know, they witness. So if you're policymakers, what would you do? You'd see that the benefits for policymakers is very short term. That's what they do all the time, most of the time. Instead of simply following the alternatives of going with China or against China, some countries of Indonesia, like Indonesia, decided to abstain, that on the ground of they have their own narrative of what happened. Well, I'm not agreeing with what the government is doing, but I'm just trying to understand why they do this. The reason that they say in the media is that they don't want to go with the propaganda of either the Western countries nor the China supporters. So again, back to the second point, you need to protect your own sovereignty. You need to be independent. The third perspective, the third narrative, is if we look closer to the pattern of trust to global governance institutions and processes, the overall pattern across the world has been lowering trust to global governance institutions, deficit of trust. The P5 countries in the world in the UN have successfully get away with their own interpretation of what's okay and what's not okay in terms of territorial integrity, sovereignty, economic development models. They can interpret what threats mean in their own ways, from threat of terrorism, threat of destabilization, threat of extreme poverty, and so on. In all of this, none of the what's mentioned in the conventions, agreements, treaties by countries are mentioned or referred to. And as you can see, human rights as the core principle of any global governance has been poorly interpreted, has been weakly and arbitrarily enforced. That's the reality that we have to understand and see. So participants, you can see the three patterns can tell us quite a lot here. Number one, development and poverty alleviation. This is of concern of all of us, should be that in time of highly interdependent world, turns out that development and poverty alleviation may be good on one side, to be high on priority, but unfortunately, this has been interpreted in a way that we have never thought it will be interpreted. Number two, protecting sovereignty. Sovereignty alone is a good thing, it's a good word. But if you look into the situation domestically, before you participate actively in saying something about what's wrong with other countries, you become so much inward looking. You become less concerned and have the braveness to speak out. And I would rather also highlight here that the fact there has been coercion among states that has been rising. Some countries whose leader try to avoid being pressured, being in an uncomfortable situation of being pressured by other countries, they prefer to avert risk. So that's the reality of point number two. Point number three, about the lack of global governance. You can see that decisions to invade other countries have been very often happen lately in the past 10 years. And it has been unilaterally being done. No multilateral discussion behind it. So it's easier said than done, of course, to imagine that we could have done better if we voice concern this and that. But in the world of politics, politicians tend to be risk averse. They don't want to do what they don't know what will be the consequences. And unfortunately, human rights is lesser known than the three items I mentioned. So I think we should not just look at the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. I'd like to draw your attention also to what happened to the Rohingyas in Myanmar, which continues on until today, turns out to be broader civil conflicts, nationwide horizontal conflicts inside of Myanmar. After the Tatmadaw declared emergency situation back in 1st February 2021 and take over all political system, as I mentioned. So number one, Myanmar, as you know, is bordering with China too. 2,129 kilometers long. It's a very, very long border. And both Rohingyas and Uyghur live on top of a fertile, natural, rich resource, strategic geographic location, and yet they are poor. They were labeled as either incompetent, or in the case of Rohingya, they said they have bad habits. And Myanmar, such labeling basically gives a wrong justification why firm action or whatever action they can say is considered legal. Second one, the Uyghur and Turkic, as well as the Rohingyas, are minority groups that, as much as we say could be understood, but in the era of social media today, this is the least understood. You may understand how they look, how they pray and everything, but how would you deal with them, especially if the government already labeled them as terrorist groups? The same thing happened in Myanmar. So, you know that in the case of Uyghur, all of this campaigns getting worse because of the People's War on Terror following the 9/11. Number three, weapons. when people get pressured so much, they start equipping themselves with weapons and anticipating the worst from the crisis. But the consequence of that is retaliation. So in the case of Myanmar, the Arakan army becomes the enemy of Tatmadaw. It becomes the narrative that instead of strengthening the narrative from the minority, it becomes becomes a boomerang. Last is the point of domesticating the issue, neutralizing the issue. If we notice in the case of Uyghur, the Chinese authorities make this Xinjiang becoming a Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, making it as a special area, special project that needs special attention. In the case of Rohingyas, Myanmar authorities declared Rohingya as non-Myanmar, not listed. So, and this become a project of trying to recognize different ethnicities in Myanmar and decide which one would belong to be in Myanmar. Unity project inside of Myanmar. So,
excuse me, but 2 minutes more, please.
Yes, I'm almost done. So, in terms of, as a conclusion from this explanation, I hope it's clear that why we have been rather quiet. It's not only a sign of ignorance and irresponsibility, but also a sign of deadlock. It's a grim situation, bleak situation growing in the world. And international relations, no reaction is a political choice, unfortunately. A choice that some countries have decided to take, usually suggesting either an inward-looking foreign policy or a very alert foreign policy to wait for the better timing to do something. Another possibility is because some of these countries choose to take most out of the uncertainty, either to avoid paying the burden dealing with the issue, or to avoid waking up the major power, as mentioned, for instance, by Malaysia. So what to do? I think the world is different from 5, let alone 10, 20 years ago that may still stick in our mind. The solidarity among non-government is also weakening if the government is not getting strong. But I'm still very certain that by raising this issue from various different angles and trying to make this more understandable to the younger generations, we may be able to awaken the pressure to the government so that this darker clouds of the 3 issues that we think is very noble for our time, sovereignty, economic development, and trust to the global governance, can be improved instead of getting weak. So with that, I'm open to discuss further later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dina. I think you have put many issues and put the challenge so we can have a contribute to this Uyghur issue in Xinjiang. Let's hear the last speakers, Mr. Feramala Anjaya. He is senior editor at the Jakarta Post from 1995 to 2020. Currently, he is a senior research fellow at of Center for Southeast Asian Studies. He holds Master Philosophy degree in Southeast Asian and Southwest Pacific Studies from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, India, and then master degree in history from University of Madras, India, and bachelor degree from Osmania University, Hyderabad, India. I just give time of use, Mr. Feramala Anjaya. Mr. Feramala, are you with us? Okay, I think we still have about 20 and 25 minutes before we are closing our webinar today. I understand Mr. Professor James Labels, it is almost midnight there. And hopefully we can have a discussion, but I want just to raise the one question before we discuss deeply about this issue is even though some of distinguished speaker has already discussed it and present it, but the question is the China's constitution guarantee citizen freedom of religious belief, but why Uyghur Muslim are oppressed in their own land? This is the question. Maybe I would like to ask Dr. Omer Khanat to explain to answer this question.
Yes, first of all, I want to correct something. I'm not doctor, so I don't have a PhD degree. So yes, I'm an Uyghur activist, I can say. Yes, okay. Yes. This this is Chinese constitution. Of course, everything is on the paper. So when China take over, the Chinese communists took over the control of East Turkestan in 1949. They promised a lot of things. There is also a territorial autonomy law also, but they didn't, respect any of these laws, It remained on the paper. So it is also the same thing. I can say the same thing for this provision of this, religious freedom in China, which is under constitution granted also. For example, in Chinese constitution also, the Uyghur language is should be the official language of our homeland, but it is already banned. There is no Uyghur language studies. There is no Uyghur language teaching now. So this is something that Chinese has been doing for since the occupation. All the promises are empty promises. There is they haven't kept any of their promises. So many Uyghurs have been even Ilham Tohti, for example, one of the Uyghur professors, he asked the Chinese government to respect their own constitution, but they sentenced him to life imprisonment. So therefore, this is all empty promises. There is no such thing as religious freedom or guarantee for believing in not believing in Chinese and constitution. It's only on the paper. That this is not in practice. It is not implemented.
Thank you very much, Mr. Omer Khanat, for the comment. And back to Feramala Anjaya, it is your time to deliver your view and perspective on this issue. Please. Yes. Please. I think it's already unmute on your microphone. Your sound has not yet heard. Okay, due technical reason, maybe Mr. Feramala Anjaya, can you test it later? And back to the discussion, I would like to have a response from Professor James Labor. What meanings of the guarantee of citizen of freedom, religious belief in Uyghurs, but in fact they are, has what you said about the Colonial Project. So what happens exactly?
Well, thanks for the question. Maybe to put it into a bit of historical context. I mean, the Colonial Project is a long-standing one that really, dates back to the Qing dynasty when the province of Xinjiang was created as a new frontier. But I think to kind of understand where the Chinese Communist Party arrived at this rather remarkably liberal and progressive constitution, you need to understand some of the strategic realities as well as influences. The Chinese Communist Party was a very small ruling party that spent most of its time running from the Chinese Nationalist Party. They were influenced, particularly with regard to its ethnic policies, by the communists, the Comintern and the Bolshevik Party in Russia. And we saw Lenin and Stalin in the establishment of the USSR adopt a very strategic nation-building project that essentially would trade loyalty for a range of protections that, as Omar Khan said, over time, ultimately would be eroded, but were institutionalized first in the Constitution, as well as a number of important legislative acts in the case of the People's Republic of China. So if we go back to the 1950s, when the communists are coming to power, they're really grappling with the fact of how they govern this massive empire with about 60% of its territory being inhabited by a small group of ethnic minority groups, including the Uyghurs and Tibetans and others, that contain strategic assets that border on 14 plus different countries. And so they decide in a really pragmatic way to grant them a whole range of rights, to recognize China as a multi-ethnic state, to carry out an ethnic classification campaign that formally recognizes 55 ethnic minority groups. It puts in place a system of regional ethnic autonomy, provides a whole range of cultural and religious and linguistic rights to these groups. And that policy, while it was decimated during the Cultural Revolution, is again kind of revived and institutionalized during the 1980s. And so we sort of see throughout the history of the PRC a kind of swinging between a kind of an approach that tries to accommodate ethnic diversity, if only for strategic reasons, and then a kind of approach to try to assimilate and transform its frontier regions. And so we're clearly in a high assimilative period under Chinese President Xi Jinping. Doesn't look like it will end anytime soon, certainly not as long as Xi is in power. The question is, of course, how far they're willing to push that, and what costs they might be willing to bear in pushing that, not only in places like Xinjiang, where it's largely been now successful, or Inner Mongolia, but to what extent would they push that in Macau or in Hong Kong.
Thank you, Professor Rebold. Mr. Anjaya, do you can speak now? I think you have a issue on the technical problem on sound. Particularly, we don't hear it. Let's continue discussion before Mr. Anjaya speaking. Dr. Ayazwani, do you have opinions or perspective on in one side, as I said, China Constitution guarantees citizen freedom of religious belief, but in fact, for Uyghur Muslim, as it seems that's not applied. Dr. Ayaz?
Yeah.
Please.
See, I will take it discuss it otherwise. What is Xinjiang is an autonomous region, but where is that autonomy? Since 1944, if we see the population transfer, they were 4%. 4% of the Hanas were living in Xinjiang in 1944. But this time, officially they are 50%, but unofficially the number of Hanas in Xinjiang may be 60 to 65% as compared to Uyghur population. Secondly, in 2013-14, I was there for 1 year. There is, see, what religious freedom means. Religious freedom does not mean that you have constitution and there is written under this article that there will be religious freedom of minorities. No, everything on that day, in that year was surveillanced by the Chinese authorities. Even the imams who were giving prayers and sermons, khutbahs during Juma prayers, most of them were the government in government services. They were paid for those sermons. And in those sermons, they were highlighting the CCP, the oneness of China, and other things. I never saw that any imam was saying that, no, there should be a headscarf is a cultural thing for Uyghurs. It is not only a religious thing for Uyghurs, a headscarf for a woman. So they forced Uyghurs to give up their culture as well as religion step-wise. So there is no religious freedom in Xinjiang, especially when we see today. Even there was no religious freedom. There was no religious freedom after 1949. Everything is surveillanced by state, and even those mullahs, either Uyghur mullahs or Hui mullahs, Hui Muslims, who go there and give sermons in those mosques, in those masjids, they are under this surveillance. They are given instructions by CCP cadres what to say, how to say, when to say. For example, when it comes to these curtailing birth rates, they used those religious leaders to ask Uyghurs to cut down their birth rates. So this is how they used religion as a tool to exploit their religion, exploit to their culture. And another thing, when I visited this Eidgah Mosque, the famous mosque in Kashgar, there were in 2013-14 more than 100 cameras. Now there may be today there may be 2,000, 3,000 surveillance cameras. So there is no religious freedom in China. But what I saw there is that symbolic resistance to Chinese rule through headscarves, through topis, through dopas. They were showing a sort of resistance to Chinese aggression. What Professor Liebord said, the Colonial Project, it is a colonial project under which they were being degraded not as humans, but inhuman practices were launched against Uyghurs from time to time in China. Now, if constitution is guaranteeing religious freedom, so that should be visible on field, practically visible. But there is no such thing. What CCP wants, they do that thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ayaz, for your perspective. And I want us this question also we will to ask to Dr. Dina, because you mentioned that China has a sovereignty, of course, but is that why this guarantee based on constitution not happens in terms of Uyghur Muslim?
Well, the constitution may say so, but the political system is authoritarian. So what can you say? In an authoritarian regime, anything can happen, in an instant, depending to how the leader interpret a political situation. So it's very, very unfortunate that authoritarianism, once it grows big, that's what I see it. Yeah, once it grows so big, then it's much harder for the other countries, the neighboring countries, to deal with. And I've said this numerous times before, that there's a growing trend that should be of concern in Southeast Asia. Due to following the rise of China, one thing that we start noticing that there's also growing interest to follow the model of authoritarianism to economic development. That being authoritarian makes you more decisive, makes you more compelling to lead and guarantee stability, which many investors, at least those who the oligarchs are listening to, say, it's much better to have stability. So apparently, all leads to this. This is the point in time when we are faced by a new parts of the history where authoritarianism gets really big and they can do whatever they want, and little of us can do about it. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, China is P5, P5 in the UN. So what can you say? Anything can be blocked in the UN. So if this is a serious reflection point from all of us. To China, Uyghur may be a minority, but to us in Southeast Asia, it's a large number of people being oppressed, being suppressed. And if they dare to do it there, they are capable of doing it anywhere else. And that should be our concern. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
I
Dina.
just wanted to add something.
Yes,
May
please, Mr. Omar Khanam.
Yes, in terms of religious repression, it is what's happening to the Uyghurs is unbelievable. In a country which the top leader Xi Jinping says that religion as a mental illness, Islam as mental illness, how could be the freedom of religion practice? What's happening is in our homeland, Uyghurs being sentenced to 10, 15 years imprisonment for attending in a religious ceremony 15 years ago. If your grandfather was a religious leader or a imam in some mosque, then his grandsons, who was even not born when his grandfather was an imam in a mosque, or being taken to the camps or sentenced to a long time imprisonment. In such an environment, how you can talk about granting freedom of religion to the people? And in a country which now there was a anti-halal campaign even in China, and as I said, we have relatives. Everybody, all the Uyghurs who live in diaspora have someone in the camp, someone in prison. All of them, most of them are because of this, because they are Muslim. Being Muslim is now a crime, being Muslim, being a Uyghur is a crime. So the criminalized Islam is criminalized in China, in East Turkestan, in my homeland. So therefore, we cannot talk about talk about the freedom of religion in this country. That's what they're granting. This is there is a genocide is going on, ongoing in our homeland, and Chinese government is committing genocide against the Uyghur people. In this situation, how we can say that, in Chinese constitution, China granted religious of freedom for other people. So it is this question is for me, as a Uyghur, is very weird, because because you have already seen and that there are overwhelming evidence of atrocities against the Uyghur people in terms of religious repression. As I said, in the camp, first when you enter the camp, first thing they want to do is to to renounce your religion, renounce your culture. And we have miraculously some people because of their connection with foreign countries or foreign citizens, married to foreign citizens, they managed to reach safety. And we talked with them, the survivor of these camps. They told us, that they were forced to say over and over again that there is no God, that I don't believe in God, I believe in the Communist Party. Say they have been forced to say it, over and over again, every day in the camp. So in this situation, you cannot even talk. You cannot even talk about, granting freedom of religion to the people. Yeah, and people are being forced to eat the things that their religion prohibit to eat, and drink the things that you are in our homeland now. Refusing to drink alcohol is being considered as have extremist ideas. This is the situation. So unbelievable. Nobody. So we are telling the people what's happening. So there are thanks to independent journalists, independent researchers now, and also leaked Chinese documents that everything is now clear. Everybody knows what's happening to the Uyghur people in East Turkestan. So therefore, now talking about religious freedom and granting religious freedom in Chinese constitution is impossible to talk about these issues. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Omar Kanat. We are in the last part of our webinar, so I would like to request to ask for the closing statement. I'll give to Professor James Label first, please.
Closing statements. I mean, it's hard to sum up what is really a human tragedy, but I think it's also important to remember there are many tragedies across the globe. Dina brought up what's happening to the Rohingya. We're all watching with horror Putin's war in Ukraine, previous unrest in Syria. These atrocities, I think, are helpful to kind of see in a kind of global comparative framework, the way in which authoritarian states driven by ideologies seek to colonize free people, to transform them in their own image, seek to pursue their own power, to stay in power at the expense of the poor and marginalized people. These things are, part and parcel of human history. But I think it's also important to understand China, to understand its rich civilization, to understand that at present China is ruled by authoritarian party state with a new strongman in President Xi Jinping, but not to demonize China, to demonize Chinese people, to understand that the Chinese civilization's got a rich tradition of openness, cosmopolitanness, of multiculturalism. And what I hope is that China can return to that past, that it can accept the diverse peoples and languages and religions it has within its territories, and demonstrate to the world the true richness of Chinese civilization and its people.
Thank you, Professor James. And from Melbourne, the midnight, back to Jakarta, Dina, would you give us the conclusion, please?
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying that back when I was in graduate school, and that was back 20 years ago, one of the main reading that we have to understand and criticize and review against different kinds of books and articles was the work of Huntington on the Clash of Civilization. At that time, I understood, I only review it based on what I understand about democracy, how I see authoritarianism being practiced in Indonesia. But as time progresses, I start to realize that even authoritarianism has many faces. But one thing for sure, none of those faces are kind to human beings. It has been very sad. It has been very concerning to me. It is such a deep regret to see that as I learn more and more about democracies and human rights, I see more and more people nowadays are attracted to the opposite side of democracy for the sake of many other reasons that they say is needed for economic development. So I think some of us should realize that economic development also has its many faces. It's not just purely elevating someone from poverty out, but there's the word of dignity. There are many processes by which people can be dignified that is often forgotten, that is often left behind. So I think based on this development in Uyghur, we hopefully can build this feeling of solidarity again in all of us. This is not just a political issue. This is not, some of the politicians may need to think about the major conflicts, the conflicts among the major powers. But for all of us who are in the academics, in the non-civil society, in the civil society activism, those who are in businesses, we should realize that that part of humanity is reflecting who we are as a generation. So hopefully we can participate somehow in stopping all of these atrocities, not only on Uyghur, but also in other parts of the world, for the sake of our next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before Mr. Omar Khanat, I would like to ask Dr. Aizat Swani to have an end of statement.
Thank you, sir. Sir, to my understanding, the world is divided. And when it comes to Chinese atrocities on Uyghurs, the world is more divided. There are countries like Muslim countries who are endorsing the Chinese re-education camps, detention of 1 million Muslims. There are Western democracies like USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and some countries in EU. They are saying that it is a genocide and they are doing inhumane cultural aggression on Uyghurs by detaining them, by indoctrinating them, by re-educating them. So, see, not all China is having not only this problem. China is becoming more and more authoritative ever since Xi Jinping became the president. So, see their activities in South China Sea, what they did in Hong Kong, what they are trying to do to Taiwan. So, to tame China, to make them more, not more aggressive, but more of a good player in global world order, it is dire need of the West and Muslim world to show some reformation in their relations, especially in this regard, West needs, and West and it is like-minded countries need to invest and reform their policies towards Muslim world. Once they will do it, then they can have a say, globe can have a say against China. Until and unless world is divided on China, we cannot tame China, especially on these minority issues and the aggression they are showing in South China Sea, and the aggression they have showed in Hong Kong, and the aggression they are showing in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayaz. The last one, Mr. Omer Kanat, please.
Thank you so much. As Dr. James labeled, and also Dr. Ayaz indicated, the Chinese government, have been using disinformation and heavy financial and diplomatic pressure on other governments, especially Muslim governments, to stay silent or support their policies. But once the people know what's happening, once they know what's happening, Muslims around the world, as I said, are getting outraged. Once the people know the situation, they can demand action. So we organized, my organization organized a conference 2 months ago in Istanbul. Many NGOs, Muslim NGOs from different countries came to that, participated in that conference. Muslim NGOs from 6 countries formed the Muslim Coalition for Uyghurs on January 30th at this conference. Now they are planning big awareness raising campaign for Ramadan this year. They have been talking with imams to ask them to talk about Uyghurs in the mosque during the Ramadan. So they are raising money for scholarship for Uyghur students in other countries, especially in Turkey, whose parents disappeared into the camps. They are setting up briefings for the members of the parliament. One group in Indonesia, for example, is organizing a petition right now to call on Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah to speak up for the Uyghurs. These are the biggest, Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country, and these 2 organizations also the biggest Muslim organization in Indonesia. A very large coalition in Malaysia, the Malaysian Consultative Council of Islamic Organization, or MAPIM, has organized a Save Uyghur Mosque campaign for social media. They have also gathered for collective actions. More than 100 groups signed open letters to Organization of Islamic Cooperation in December 2020 and December 2021, calling on OIC to follow its charter. So what I want to say is, although the Muslim majority governments, countries are silent, the governments are silent, still silent, or cooperating or supporting Chinese narrative, or praising Chinese treatment of Chinese treatment of Uyghurs. But now there are some movement in Muslim countries to raise awareness among the Muslim population, among the Muslim communities. So this is now going very well. I think I'm hopeful. I'm that at the end of the day, maybe these Muslim population in their own countries, will put pressure on their own politicians, on their parliament, on their government, at least to act. It is not. It is as one of speakers said, Western propaganda. It's not a Western propaganda. or Chinese propaganda versus Western propaganda. It is what Western countries speaking out because of this overwhelming evidence of genocide, overwhelming of this crimes against humanity, atrocities against the Uyghur people. At the end, I hope that because of this, NGOs in Muslim countries, at the end, the Muslim governments will also speak up against what's happening to Uyghurs, because this is not only an insult or attack against the Uyghur people. What's happening in the region is an attack on Islam. They are destroying the mosques. They are banning Islam, practice of the Islam. So this is something that should, outrage all the Muslim community in the world, all the Muslims in the world. In the long term, it is also again maybe against the interest of the Chinese state itself. So they should understand that. And what we want from the Muslim countries, we don't want the Muslim countries to fight, against China or maybe not criticize China openly. If they have this friendship, this good relation, they can go and tell the Chinese leaders that, what they are doing is wrong. What they are doing is also, against the whole Muslim world. It will enrage the Muslim world. It will upset the Muslim world, and it will affect their relations with China. So they can tell the Chinese leaders very, friendly that they should stop this ongoing genocide, ongoing assault against the Uyghur Muslims. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Omer Kanat. I would like to have a photo session before we are ending of this webinar. Please open the camera. And Mr. Jihan, can you take your photograph for us?
Yeah. Okay. 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Asef.
Again, thank you very much to all respected and distinguished speaker, particularly Professor James Leibold at midnight in Canberra time. Thank you very much indeed, also for Omer Kanat from Virginia, US, and Dr. Dina, Peramala Anjaya, Dr. Ayaz Swani from Srinagar, who has participating in this webinar. I'm very delighted. My name is Asef Setiawan again. Thank you very much. Hopefully we have a solution and the future better for Uyghur in Xinjiang. Thank you very much. On behalf of CSEAS, I would like to thank you all, to you and participants and also audience. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. See you again.
Goodbye. Thank you.